But actually, my name's Andrew Puddifat. I'm the Director of Global Partners. We are the current Secretariat for the Freedom Online Coalition. I have to say, this is the first internet conference I've been to where the technology works completely. I don't know if that's other people's experience. I'm really impressed with Estonia. So my guests, starting from the far right, is Michael Nelson, who's a principal strategist from Microsoft, which sounds a colossal task to take on. Then we've got Tom Malinowski, the, I think, very newly confirmed Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights and Labour in the United States State Department. Frank LaRue in the middle, I think familiar to many of you, a really great UN Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Expression, who's done some of the most crucial work on, in fact, was the person who argued first that human rights offline should be the same online. And it was his report to the Human Rights Council in 2011 that led to the Human Rights Council resolution in 2012. So I think we have a lot to thank Frank for. And then my colleague and friend Anya Kovacs from the Internet Democracy Project in India. So we have a mixture. We have a multi-stakeholder panel, which I think is very good given the kind of topic of today. The topic of today is sort of fundamental freedoms online. And I'm reflecting on this morning, listening to President Ilves, reminding us of the early libertarian optimism that really affected the way the internet first developed with, as I always think of him, the Grateful Dead guitarist, who actually said, you know, the internet interprets censorship as damage and roots around it. And I think the belief among many of the early developers of the internet is it could exist outside of politics, geography, the constraints of state sovereignty and so on. And I remember the optimism of that, you know, going back to, I was in Cairo in 1999, actually talking about the impact of satellite broadcasting. This is before Al Jazeera had actually been launched, and the impact that satellite broadcasting would have on the Arab world. And at that time, you could look at the Cairo Times online edition in English, which was probably read by a very small number of people, and it was a completely different newspaper to the Cairo Times Arabic, which was the printed paper that went through the censor's hands. Because the censors didn't bother with the internet. It was an English language, elite, minority medium. Nobody really thought about it. It never really impacted. So it could say things, and you could get things, and you could access information about Egypt and the rest of the world via an English language internet medium you never could through an Arabic language newspaper. I think that libertarian optimism I would put to the panel, first of all, has now pretty much dissolved. And if anything we've learned in the last few years is that politics, geography, state sovereignty are now central issues in the internet. To paraphrase Clausewitz, the internet is now politics by other means. And as Clausewitz said about war, in war everything is very simple, but the simplest things are very difficult because of friction. And I think what we're seeing now in the internet environment internationally is a great deal of friction and a great deal of politics. And that's really impacting, I think, on the kind of medium that most of us want the internet to be, most of the values that the Freedom Online Coalition would stand for or aspire to. And that's, I think, a real challenge that I really want to put to you as a panel. It seems to me there are a number of factors we need to take into account. First of all is a very determined attempt by a number of governments to assert the doctrine of state sovereignty over the internet, to say this should not be a global medium. This should be something that we should regulate within our own borders, and we should break essentially that international connectivity that's been so powerful and effective. That's one big, I think, force we face. The second is increasingly sophisticated and I think often very successful attempts, technically, politically, normatively, legally, to censor speech and the free flow of information online. I think we're seeing those restrictions right across many parts of the world, and I think it's a significant challenge. Thirdly, we're seeing a debate and an unease, I would say, about the role of powerful companies and the responsibilities of powerful companies who deliver significant internet services. And that often focuses on the social media companies, but I think the issues go broader than that. Fourthly, we've seen the recent allegations and debates about surveillance, and particularly the surveillance by agencies in democratic countries, which has thrown a whole series of opportunities to those countries who want to repress free speech and the free flow of information, to use that as a justification, But it's also made people more uncertain about the internet they're using, less trusting, feeling less secure in it. That seems to me another challenge. And fifthly, there's really now a discussion about the whole way that the internet is governed, and a challenge to the notion that everybody has a seat at the table, that representatives of civil society, the technical community, governments and business can actually seek to resolve some of these big issues in a consensus fashion, or at least in a fashion where the consensus policies are developed before they're submitted to national legislatures or formal legal processes. And there's a real challenge to the legitimacy of civil society at even being at the table. You know, many people, many governments don't like those of us who are in civil society suddenly sitting down at a table in a discussion about a conference declaration or outcome because they're not comfortable with people like us being at the table. So there's a challenge to the whole model of governance that's evolved. So my question to the panel, I'm going to ask each of them to reflect on this from their own perspectives in the first instance, and then we'll start a conversation between us and the audience, is how it's a messy world. It's not a simple, optimistic, open world. It's a messy world. In that messy world, lots of us who have interests which are actually closely aligned can very easily find ourselves arguing with each other. How do we build, what kind of partnerships can we build? What are our allies? Who can we reach out to actually shape and defend an internet that's based on human rights values and abides by core democratic principles? And how do you see the challenges from each of your perspectives, from the UN, from a government perspective, from a civil society perspective, and a business perspective? What do you see the environment offering in the next couple of years, and where do you see the responses and challenges coming from in areas like the Freedom Online Coalition, but much broadly than that, in the wake of events like Net Mundial? So Frank, I know you arrived last, but I'm going to put you on first as the UN Special Rapporteur, just to give us your thoughts and reflections on how we might approach this, the messy world we now find ourselves in.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for putting me first in the messy work. Let me begin, first of all, by excusing myself. I'm literally coming off the plane, and my luggage did not come with me, so I apologize for being a bit on the sporty side. I didn't have time to change, and I didn't have a luggage to change. Two things. When I made my report to the General Assembly that Andrew was mentioning, I think it was very interesting that my contribution was not going to be on the technical side of internet, because the debate on the technical side moves on itself by the corporations themselves and the researchers and the academic world. My contribution was going to be to enhance the human rights focus that should be applied to internet, something that we had all been talking about, but I thought that we had to re-emphasize it from the UN perspective. And as time has gone by, and as it was well received, I have discovered that because internet is a worldwide service, and because we talk about universality of the internet, the first issue is the human rights focus. This is what will homogenize our views. In several of the latest meetings, including the Net Mundial meeting in Brazil with ICANN, there was a whole debate of whether there's a crisis going into the multi-stakeholder dialogue, and how representative is that dialogue, or how much weight do all sectors have. But the one issue that no one can challenge, because it's equally important to all, is the human rights perspective. And interestingly enough, human rights tends to be an international consensus. So number one, human rights focus brings us an homogenizing perspective, and I think this is very good. Not only from the freedom of expression point of view, which is what I focus, but from other rights, the right to scientific research, the right to access information, the right to education, the right to free association, the right to cultural diversity, and the right to development. I mean, many rights that can be exercised through the internet. Secondly, the question of universality. If all rights are universal and the exercise of rights are universal, it means that we have to try to make internet as an instrument, not as a right, as an instrument of exercising right, universal. In content, with full content, with no censorship, and this is very important. Many countries like to evade the content side because they like to censor what they don't like. And we have to make also universal access to connectivity, infrastructure, and equipment accessible to all, to the poorest sectors of society. And for me, this is important. And finally, the last challenge with the human rights focus, the universality, is the protection of the fact that internet has to be neutral. If we don't protect the neutrality, which is what I think is being challenged, the debate of today, we will lose its effectiveness. The beauty of internet is that it's a single service to the whole world, without boundaries, without borders and frontiers, without differences of culture, language, or political systems or perspectives. It should be neutral to the world, to serve the world. That is, I think, the biggest challenge today, and is to keep that neutrality. And that's where I think the UN has to focus its efforts in maintaining the human rights perspective and protecting the neutrality of the internet.
Thanks, Frank. Mike, as a strategist, how would you advise Microsoft in the current era around these kinds of challenges? How do you see it?
Well, I'm going to take a somewhat different perspective. Your opening remarks were wonderful. You gave this incredible tour of the horizon of all the issues out there. You also summarized the syllabus for a class that I've been teaching at Georgetown called What's Shaping the Internet.
Right.
I spent an entire semester on what you just described, and I'm sure my other panelists could spend a semester as well. So I'm just going to focus real quick on three things that we're doing. The first thing is that I think we need to spend more time looking at the technology side. Before lunch, one of the breakout sessions spent quite a bit of time looking at how better technology can protect human rights for people online. Microsoft is implementing end-to-end encryption, both between our customers and our cloud services, and between our cloud data centers, so that our data can be encrypted all through as it transits the net. That's incredibly important. So is having better identity services, so that we can protect the privacy of individuals. In many cases, we don't need to know exactly who someone is. We just need to know certain attributes about them to provide the services they want. So there's a number of things we can do in the technology side, and I can go into that in detail. But I also wanted to talk about the challenge of trying to ensure that we have the right environment that drives human rights and convinces governments and companies to do the right thing. I'm trained as a physicist. I worked at IBM for 10 years. When I was there, we often had the direct approach. There was a problem, we tried to go straight at the problem and find a solution. We're doing that with documents like we produced here, the principles. We're doing that with technology. But at IBM, I also learned about the inside-out approach, where you need to go and shape the environment, shape the culture, shape the attitudes of the broad public and of the market, so that they demand what you want. In many cases, in our case, we were often trying to push new technologies, and we found that just trying to convince IBM to sell a new technology didn't work as well as getting all of our customers excited about it and having them call for it. So one thing that Microsoft's doing, and we outlined this very effectively in a document that was released last September, the Microsoft Global Human Rights Statement. It talks about what we're doing to protect online users, but it also talks about what we're doing to push governments to put in place a rule of law that actually implements the promises they've made. We've seen too many cases where countries have great statements on how they're going to protect human rights, but they don't do it. So we need to somehow build support and convince citizens, convince the media to put pressure on governments. So we're funding NGOs around the world, providing them with free software, providing them with support, so that they can provide this pressure 365 days of the year on their government to protect human rights. There's a very old joke, about 30 years old, about the rule of law. It goes like this. In America, that which is not explicitly forbidden is allowed. In Germany, that which is not explicitly allowed is forbidden. Luckily, in Germany, they allow lots of things. In the former Soviet Union, that which is explicitly allowed is forbidden. And in Italy, of course, that which is explicitly forbidden is allowed. And I think that
I think you might be in trouble with some of these jokes there. Just
it nicely captures the fact that commitments have to be followed up with enforcement, and that's what we're trying to do. The last thing I'd say is, and I say this as a futurist, is that we need to start thinking about where we're going to be in 5 or 10 years. I spend a lot of my time thinking about the year 2020, and I haven't heard anybody here talking about the Internet of Things and what it's going to be like when each of us have 50 or 100 devices that interact with the Internet and collect data about us. That brings up all sorts of new human rights conundrums, and we have to start thinking now about what that's going to be like. So that's a lot of what I do at Microsoft, is try to future-proof the policies that we're advocating for today. So that's lecture number 1 in my class.
thanks. And we got it for nothing. That's great.
Quite a deal.
Yeah. So thanks. So Tom, Frank was talking about some of the overarching goals, and Mike just talked about some of the technical tools and the environmental issues. I guess on the policy front is where you come in. How do you see the policy challenges and governments like yours addressing those specific policy challenges over the next few years?
Sure. Thanks, and thanks for laying out the question so well. I'll say a little bit about how the United States government views that question. We'll hear a lot more from our Secretary of State, who will speak to us later this afternoon. And then I'll be, if there are, on the off chance there are any questions for the United States, I'll be happy to take them or refer them to my lawyer. So we came here to defend freedom in the virtual world. That's all I thought I'd be doing here when I first looked forward to coming to this conference a few months ago, actually. But it's very hard to be in Estonia, in the Baltic states, in this part of Europe at this moment with the crisis unfolding not too far away between Russia and Ukraine, and not think about the much more old-fashioned challenges to freedom in the physical world that we still face. The first great power aggression against a sovereign country in Europe in decades. I just got a message that the pro-Kiev mayor of Kharkiv, the main city and largest city in eastern Ukraine, was shot. These are the things that occupy our minds first and foremost right now. And it's one reason why, in addition to a delegation of internet freedom advocates, including myself, we have a delegation of American soldiers coming to Estonia this week to send a message about where we stand. But I think I raise this in part because these issues, these two forms of freedom, are very much related. Remember what preceded Russia's intervention in Ukraine. It was a crackdown inside Russia on freedom of expression, offline and online. And it's not a coincidence, because that crackdown, which systematically removed critical voices from the political space inside Russia, was what enabled this kind of dangerous action to unfold without the checks and balances that exist in democratic societies. So that's a way of reminding us of the stakes that we face in this debate. It's not just an issue of ethics and morality and human rights. It's about our safety. It's about our security. And that's why the United States opposes, one reason why we oppose restrictions on freedom of expression online and offline all around the world, whether it's in Russia or Ukraine, or in Turkey, or in Egypt, or in China, in Ethiopia, where just a few days ago a group of pro-human rights and democracy bloggers were arrested by the government there. It's why we support the multi-stakeholder system of internet governance. It's why we oppose the fragmentation of the internet into numerous sovereign and separate spaces that will divide the world rather than bringing us together. And yes, it's a messy debate and it's a messy world, but I think it's messy because the stakes are so high. The stakes are high for us. The stakes are also high for governments that are threatened by freedom of expression, that have always been threatened by freedom of expression, and particularly by this unregulated, gloriously unregulated space that we have constructed through the World Wide Web. And I think we're not doing so badly, actually, when I think about the stakes on the other side and how much progress we've made in holding the line in defending the system, including in the Brazil conference. Now, we also understand that in order to defend the system, we, the United States, we democratic countries around the world, have to set a good example in the way we respect freedom online, and including in the way that we respect privacy online. We've had a little debate recently in the United States. You guys probably haven't heard much about it. It's, it's a domestic issue. And I think, we've come to this point for a number of reasons, but primarily because of the extraordinary explosion in the technological capacity of governments in the private sector to know more and more and more and more about ordinary people. We've come to a point where that futuristic vision in Orwell's 1984 of a telescreen in everybody's home is close to being technologically possible. And that's an extraordinary change, because in the past, a government's ability to spy on people has been limited technologically. So even if any government, had the desire to do certain things, it would not have been able to act on that desire. And right now, we're close to a point where there are no technological limits, which means for the first time in history, what governments can do in this realm is only limited by the choices we make, by the political choices and the legal choices that we make. And we are beginning now to catch up to that reality and to have a conversation in democratic society about exactly what the boundaries between what is private and what is not private should be. And that's a very important and healthy debate. Our president, President Obama, has, I think, gotten a good start in laying out the principles that will guide the policies of the United States in answering that question. It's just a start. His speech, which I assume many of you read, laid out principles which we are now working to implement in practice, and that process will take time, and it will benefit from the input of voices from civil society and from our allies and friends around the world. I think when we get through this debate, these principles of transparency, of right purpose, of oversight, will, if broadly adopted, increase respect for privacy throughout the world, including in many democratic countries, in addition to the United States. Let me close on a more personal note. I'm here to speak for my government. I'm here to speak as an American citizen and American official. I'm also a child of Eastern Europe, born in Poland in the communist times. And that, from that, you can probably conclude two things about my outlook on this issue. Number one, I care viscerally about privacy, more so than many of my American friends, even many of my friends who are American and active in the human rights movement, because of what I heard from my parents and my grandparents about what they experienced. But I also think it gives me a sense of perspective, a capacity to distinguish between violations of privacy in a democratic society and violations of privacy in societies where they lead to violence and terror. And I think we need to maintain the capacity to make that distinction in a world where, in many countries, surveillance leads to violence and terror. I'll close with a quote or a paraphrase, since I don't have it in front of me, from my favorite Russian chess master and opposition politician, Garry Kasparov, who said that the character of a government is determined not by how it treats data, but how it treats people. And I would say that we care passionately about the former because we care even more about the latter. And I'll leave with that.
Thanks, Tom. Anya, you're someone who's been very active in recent years in internet government debates as a very vocal, committed, and a highly respected civil society advocate. How are you finding the situation as it evolves now?
Well, I think my remarks are going to be fairly colored by the Net Mondiale, which we just had. Today I've heard a lot of conversation about dialogue and conversation all the time. And that's kind of posited as a solution to many of the problems that we face. I think there's a lot of agreement on the problems, but it's very clear that dialogue and conversation is not enough by far to solve them. And I think from a civil society perspective, the Net Mondiale made that very clear, and also made very clear a lot of the weaknesses of the multi-stakeholder system as it exists. For people who weren't there, what happened was that in this amazing meeting, which was amazing in many ways, there were a wide range of very strong statements and 3 topics that civil society was particularly concerned about were addressed strongly as well. That was network neutrality, mass surveillance, not just surveillance in general, and access to knowledge. And as the text was redrafted in smaller groups, some very strong language on at least several of these topics were integrated as well. And then at the very end, there was a high-level committee meeting in which all that very strong text was thrown out at the very last minute. And in some cases, especially on the access to knowledge issue, replaced by text that definitely for people from developing countries is actually unacceptable, and as far as I'm concerned, is a step backwards. It's not just a neutralizing. And that was a very frustrating experience, and I think it really showed, I think what Dunya also was earlier hinting at in her comments, we have all these large commitments in very general language, and you see that again in the recommendations that the coalition has made here, which are, they're nice. But increasingly, one gets the feeling that all of this talk is also fairly meaningless if at the very last moment of this process, despite these very strong statements on a variety of topics from such a wide range of people, in the supposed multi-stakeholder system where we are collaborating together, it's very clear that either businesses or countries with a lot of power have the power to overturn text at the very last moment. And so increasingly, I think one got a feeling in the Net Mondial that multi-stakeholderism is becoming a little bit of a way to whitewash the way that both political and financial power are actually really setting the internet governance agenda today. And despite the fact that people, for example, were talking so strongly about mass surveillance, effectively one government could make sure that the reference to mass surveillance was removed from the agenda in the end, and even saying that they felt mass surveillance does not, by definition, violate the right to privacy. And I think that statement kind of showed very well how the understanding of this very general language that we have, for example, in the recommendation is still clearly very, very diverse. I think for most people in the room, it was a given that mass surveillance is by definition a violation of the right to privacy. So if we are not going to go into that kind of a detail, and if we are not going to actually have decisions that are based on what the large majority of people, citizens, clearly think, then I think this whole process is not very valuable. There was also certain frustration, I think, with the technical community and all of this. I think the technical community that's very active in these spheres also often is part of organizations that have quite a lot of money and have increasingly so if you look, for example, at ICANN. And I find it really interesting, for example, to see how more and more people in the technical community are making a split or trying to narrow the definition of internet governance back down to the governance of the internet, not governance on the internet. Well, I think in the case of surveillance, for example, it's very clear that they are intimately linked, because if we are going to inscribe more security into the architecture of the internet, there might be a need for at least some extent of policy also to make sure that that happens consistently. For example, to force businesses to do that consistently. And so this kind of split, I think for that reason, is very dangerous. It kind of perhaps makes sure that those organizations that do the technical governance of the internet will continue with the multi-stakeholderism, and a model that has benefited them and the way they see their ecosystem grow. But it hasn't necessarily benefited the larger internet community. It definitely doesn't benefit people who care about so many of the human rights issues that are really also about governance on the internet. So again, I felt we were being used a little bit as a kind of a shield to promote a model where at the end of the day, in the very final outcome of that meeting, we didn't get back very much. And I think that was a disappointing experience. Civil society is, of course, also thinking about what we can do better and differently in all of this. But I think it's really important to emphasize this point, that governments do need to make far stronger statement. So I think the recommendations should have had stronger language. I really like Dunya's and Rebecca's call to have a report card. But again, if you look at the language in that text, it's so vague that if you want to set benchmarks, you actually need to look at much more concrete targets, because otherwise, how are you going to measure that? It's not really there. And I think, for example, if you look also at the coalition in general, somebody said in the morning it's a bottom-up initiative. How is the Freedom Online Coalition a bottom-up initiative? I think it's, again, using language to make something seem nice that doesn't really have all that much substance. We lose in the end, we don't gain. And as a coalition, I haven't really seen the impact either. We follow the WSIS Plus 10 review process, for example, where human rights are also a very contentious topic. And some governments that are members of the coalition have been fantastic, and I must especially commend Sweden, actually, where the Swedish representative, all in his own, has been fantastic in consistently defending those values and principles. But there are more Freedom Online Coalition governments in that room, and I don't see them consistently do that. It's sometimes difficult for civil society to do that consistently vis-à-vis repressive governments that are in the room, if those governments aren't committing, right? So I think for us, this is at the moment a big challenge, that is the multi-stakeholder model with all the challenges that we are facing. And I think, again, we agree on the challenges. Is it actually going to deliver the solutions? Or were we perhaps better off with the more traditional outside of the negotiation room strategies?
Lobbying from the outside rather than the inside. But can I come back on that? I just want to ask you something. The way you've described it, you see, obviously governments have a lot of traditional power in international negotiations. So larger companies can be powerful. They can deploy, very experienced, smart people to represent them. The technical community is well funded. So you're really talking about the civil society, public interest community. Is the problem in the process that is simply underpowered, not strong enough, not resourced enough, not effective enough to make sure it can, in that multi-stakeholder process, argue its corner? Or do you think there's something structurally wrong? We haven't found the structure to enable a genuine multi-stakeholder policy process to take place. So my question is whether the problem is in the structure or the problem is in the actors, because there are different solutions depending on which answer you come to.
I do think to some extent the thing about being at the table is, of course, also that you're expected to participate in a different way. And I think for civil society, some of the challenge also still lies in figuring out how to do that exactly. For example, if you have government negotiations, governments prefer details of the conversation not to go out. For civil society, a lot of its power actually lies precisely in informing a larger audience about what's happening. That is the power of civil society. And so it's a very tricky thing to kind of find that balance. How do you do that exactly? So it's definitely partly that. But I do think we need also to look more at the whole debate about what multi-stakeholderism is. For example, it struck me also that in the declaration it says multi-stakeholder model. That whole phrase in itself is a large debate. We don't use model anymore. We consistently say approach, which is recognizing also that in different fora, on different issues, this will play out differently. Sometimes governments will still have a final decision-making. But then the question is, so what is the role of civil society then? And I think in all of these elements, there needs to be much more detail about what we can expect, how we are actually going to organize this. If we leave it at this vague level, it becomes too much of a feel-good language that at the end of the day doesn't give very much. Just one thing I did want to point out, though, it wasn't only civil society. On several issues, some people in the technical community also pushed quite hard, and I think especially a lot of developing countries pushed very hard for strong language against mass surveillance, for strong language that would be pro-access to knowledge and not have such a privileging of intellectual property rights. So it wasn't just civil society in that sense. And I think, again, if you look at which governments this is, and which groups do not get their interests in the agenda at the end, it raises real questions about how the power balance in multi-stakeholderism is still massively skewed, and perhaps increasingly so, and that needs a structural correction, otherwise it's not worth it.
Okay, I'm going to just a bit more exchange with the panel, and then I'm going to come out to the wider audience. But Frank first, and then Mike, and then...
No, very, very briefly, following the logic of Anya, but turning it around, is that the multi-stakeholder dialogue that began didn't begin just because people wanted to feel good, but also began because it's necessary to make internet effective. The irony is that in this case, from the beginning, from the outset, it was said multi-stakeholder dialogue. No one wanted one institution, the ITU or any other institution, by technical or global as it may be, to take control of the governance of the internet. So everyone felt we all have to participate. And there's a rationale to that, is because we all are using it and it benefits us all. But I think that idea is coming into crisis because not all people are feeling like equal actors. So I think we have to relook at that, because we all want to save internet, and we all want to keep it neutral, and we all want to make it effective. So I think no one is challenging the idea of multi-stakeholder dialogue. What is being challenged is the weight of all the different opinions. And secondly, the problem if we let this grow is that then everyone will come back, and this I'm already seeing from a legal perspective, everyone will come back to the discussion of jurisdiction. What jurisdiction should be applied in terms of law to the internet, and then we'll split up the world in areas of jurisdiction, and we'll mess up the internet, because an internet split up by territories or by interest won't work. And I think some corporations are beginning to see this, is why they're getting closer to civil society. But I think it's important that everyone participates in this dialogue, because we all have a stake at this.
Just to add a little bit, I'm kind of Mr. Multi-Stakeholder. I personally represent at least 3 different sectors. I'm at Microsoft, but I'm also teaching at Georgetown as an academic. I'm a technologist, and I've been very involved in the Internet Society. So I could argue that I could go to each different meeting and be part of each different stakeholder group. I think one of the challenges for your civil society groups is to really embrace the multi-stakeholder model and realize that what's happening today is that different parts of the community are making different decisions. The civil society community tends to think that the most important thing to do is to convince governments to do the right thing, and then they will tell everybody else what to do. That's not right. You should be engaging much more strongly with the technical community, so the technical community can find solutions to some of your problems that won't even involve much the governments. I was involved 20 years ago when the Internet Engineering Task Force was trying to decide what IPv6 would look like. The government's engaged. The FBI showed up at a meeting of the IETF in Washington and said, why don't you redesign this internet protocol so that there's no anonymity left? Only a couple people from the privacy community showed up. Luckily, the engineers almost universally said, no, we like the internet protocol the way it is. But you can be more engaged in those technical decisions. You can be more engaged in how encryption rolls out. And those are decisions that will be led by the technical community. And I think you could also do a lot more to work from the outside in. Do what the landmine community did 15 years ago. They didn't go straight to the governments and petition the governments to ban landmines. They mobilized millions of people, voters, who then provided the outside pressure. And what I saw in Brazil was a lot of people in the civil society seeming to assume that the governments had the last word. And they don't. With the internet, we've built this decentralized process where a lot of different people make decisions. You're pressuring us. We're working very closely with the Global Network Initiative, which is actually being discussed in the other room right now. A lot of very important civil society groups, including the Center for Democracy and Technology, which has technologists on it, are helping us find ways to do a better job of using technology to protect human rights. And that doesn't need to be something the governments spend much time on at all. We can do that by ourselves with the advice of civil society.
Tom, I just want to ask you, I know you sat on both sides of the fence. You've been active in civil society as well as now in government. Do you think that governments find it easy to give up power, to share power? Do you think it's, how do you see the issues about embracing views that come outside of the traditional area of intergovernmental negotiations when it comes to some very key issues, given how crucial the internet's become as a geopolitical issue?
No. Of course. Governments don't find it easy to give up power, and there's always a tension. There's a tension within governments. We have within every democratic government groups of people and organizations who are told by their elected leaders, your job is to protect us. And it's their job to fight for as much power as they can in order to achieve that goal. It is then the job of others in that government, and particularly in civil society, to say, yes, we want you to do that, but there are limits. And what we're seeing now is, I think in democratic countries, a mostly positive and almost entirely sincere, from my point of view, effort to find the right balancing point. And I don't think we could possibly find it if not for the debate that has been led by civil society. And I think we end up as governments much stronger after that debate has happened.
Okay, thanks. I'm going to throw it open now. I mean, feel free to either put questions about things you've heard, but if there are, you also have your own thoughts about how you see the challenges in the years to come to add to the conversation, I think that would be very welcome. So don't feel confined by what you've already heard. Please feel free to come in. So do we have mics? Yeah. So we got start at the front here, and then, yep, further down.
I'm Vince Cerf. I'm Google's chief internet evangelist and one of the inventors of the internet. And I'd like to draw your attention to its architecture for a moment as you begin to address these questions. It's a layered structure. And although the Americans don't seem to recognize that at the FCC, in fact, it does have structure. And in some of the reports that my colleagues and I have written, we've noticed that there's a physical layer where all of the hardware goes and the wires and the lasers. Then there is a layer of logical layer where we're dealing with domain names and internet addresses and the like. And then on top of that, we've chosen to name the next one the content layer, because that's really where content flows around, whether it's email and documents and movies and the like. Then there's another layer on top of that we call the social layer, which deals with the behavior of human beings. And the reason I go to all this trouble, and thank you for allowing me to do that, is to say that the multiple stakeholders that have an interest in and are capable of responding to issues arising may vary depending on where those issues show up, in which layers they appear. And so when you hear multi-stakeholder and you imagine this means that for every issue arising on the net, every single party in the entire world that ever used the internet should be part of the solution, this is not rational. There are 7 billion people on the planet. But there may be a subset who do have much to say and should have much to say about particular issues arising. And so I hope that we keep in mind rational ways of implementing multi-stakeholder models so that we actually get an outcome that is effective and it protects the various freedoms that you've been talking about. One last point, I hear much about freedom of expression, freedom of access to information, freedom to share. But I hope people will remember freedom from harm is something that we are also looking for, that safety in the net needs to be there. We need technical and legal mechanisms for achieving that safety, because if we don't, we won't want to use it because we won't feel safe using it, and that would be a real pity.
When you talked about the different actors being relevant in different layers, how does that, one of the big questions that I think is in everyone's mind, I know Anya's thinking about that as well, is who gets to decide who are the right voices within the individual layers? How does that process happen if you're on the outside of it and you think, actually, I have an interest here, I care about this, how do I get involved?
So the honest answer is that if you believe you have an interest, then you have an interest. And so, to draw your attention to the way things work in the Internet Engineering Task Force, which I accept as a relatively homogeneous collection of geeks compared to the vast range of issues arising. But in that system, you form working groups around problems, and anybody who has something to say is free to show up. My view is that the same thing will occur in this case. I'm just trying to say that if someone says, oh, not everybody showed up for this, therefore it's not a valid result, I am sorry, but I reject that. I think if the people who wish to show up and believe they have an interest are free to do that, then we have done our job. But I don't think it's fair to say that if everyone wasn't there, it's not a valid result.
I want to come to Bertrand, actually, put a question to he's not expecting it, but
My partner in
you heard Vint talk about the model that a lot of the governance models in the internet have come from the technical community and the way it was originally engineered. And you turn up, you've got a voice, you reach consensus. When it comes to public policy issues, I mean, Anya made it very clear. On intellectual property, you won't find a consensus. On net neutrality, you won't find a consensus. On a number of human rights issues, the balance between privacy and security, it's very hard to find a consensus. So how do we think about the big public policy, human rights, democracy issues within this kind of environment? You know, how does the model that is consensus-based, based on arriving at a solid engineering approach, actually translate into a much more contested political space?
Well, first of all, I'd like to support what Vin said regarding addressing issues. Sorry, for those who don't know me, I'm Bertrand Lachapelle from the Internet and Jurisdiction Project, and Andrew has almost hijacked my capacity to ask a question. Yeah, supporting Vin's comment that basically governance issues regarding the internet need to be addressed on an issue-by-issue basis, and that the relevant stakeholders are different. The point, to respond to your question, is there is a fundamental difference between, as Anya said, the governance on and the governance of the internet. When we talk about the governance of the infrastructure, we tend to forget that the characteristic is that the logical layer was conceived as something that was global, universal, from the onset. And therefore, it was very natural at the beginning that the structures to handle this, all the ecosystem, was conceived as global. The problem with everything that has to do with the social layer now is that the starting point is the fragmented legal systems, and that we're dealing with something that is extremely difficult, which is harmonization and convergence. When you label the question of consensus, I am not sure that it is impossible to find consensus. I'm even convinced that it is possible to find consensus. The problem is, it is not possible at this point in time to have consensus and universality of states. That's the biggest problem, and the person from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Japan basically was saying more or less the same in the previous panel. We now are at a juncture where everything that has been attempted to find consensus on freedom of expression, privacy, and the rest in an intergovernmental dialogue at the global level with the prerequisite that everybody is in the room leads to an impossibility of consensus. Hence, the discussions and the initiatives like this one and a new format need to be as inclusive as possible, as open as possible, but fundamentally try to build a system that gets, I purposefully not say like-minded people, because they may not be like-minded, but they are jointly trying to cooperate as opposed to trying to separate. And the big fight is today between people who want to find international regimes to cooperate among the actors versus people who want to maintain and reimpose the separation of sovereignties on the global network.
Frank, can I come back to you? I think Bertrand's saying that at the intergovernmental level, it's very difficult to make progress on some of these core fundamental freedom values, that things just get caught up in the politics, and therefore the multi-stakeholder model, or a different model, is bringing in different voices, is a way of actually solidifying the human rights consensus you talked about. Is that your experience? You dealt with the Human Rights Council. You dealt with governments very hostile to your recommendations. I know they've been very angry with some of the things you've recommended. What are your reflections on that, if you like, implied critique of the inability of our existing system to actually deliver things?
Well, some countries are willing to pay the price of isolation, which is what they're doing, to have their own firewall and their own system of censorship and control internet. But I think that we have to come to the realization that if we have a human rights focus, obviously it won't be easy for those countries that violate human rights regularly on other bases, not only on internet. But if you have a human rights focus, you have a common standard that everyone looks at and a common guideline that one can measure every state too. And I think this is basically what the UN should do, because the principle of universality of human rights was really important here. How do we homogenize the responsibility of all states? I keep on saying that every state's assumed responsibility, yes, by the international conventions they sign and ratify. But beyond that, there's also a common international co-responsibility of upholding human rights. Human rights exist because the international community believes they're right. Otherwise, they wouldn't exist. It's not only, yes, there's a more legal obligation than those that we have ratified by state, but there's still a common consensus in the world that peace is preserved in the world somehow by preserving and protecting human rights. And I think this is important. This is not to say that you have rogue nations that obviously systematically violate human rights and that may not even be interested in having internet in their own territory. But again, I find it very difficult in the world of the future that any society can survive without internet. It's going to be a crucial element for development. Which is why, again, the multi-stakeholder dialogue is not only a question of intentionality, I think it's a necessity of internet.
Mike?
Just to build on that,
I'm going to come back, sir.
Microsoft has endorsed this statement on human rights for a number of reasons. First off, and most importantly, it's the moral thing to do. The second, as you and Tom both said, human rights, where they exist, foster peace, democracy, stable governments, which obviously is good for business. But there's a really interesting third reason human rights are important. And this was brought home to me as I was flying on the way to Tallinn. I was sitting next to a fellow who works for a company that's based in Finland, and he related a story. He was talking to one of his Indian colleagues who said that if he was given a choice between working in India or working in China, if he could only do one or the other, he would definitely work in India because the Indians were used to speaking their mind. They had freedom of expression. Now, Microsoft works in both, so we're fine. But his argument was because they're used to freedom of expression, when their boss tells them to do something stupid, they don't do it. They fight back. And stupid things are prevented, money's not wasted, time isn't wasted. And so that culture of open dialogue, of creativity, is fostered by human rights as well. And that's a cultural aspect that we don't often think. But that's very good for business as well as being good for humanity.
Anya, yeah.
Very good for
Coming from
democracy.
India.
Just first to still respond to Michael's earlier comment about what civil society could do. The interesting thing is that both of the things you mentioned are things civil society can do without multi-stakeholderism. That was exactly my earlier point. Working from the outside in is what civil society traditionally does. We don't need multi-stakeholderism for that. In the same way, working with the technical community to get them to do something that they will need to be responsible for, because that's their expertise, again, is something for which we don't necessarily need multi-stakeholderism. That was my point. What I find interesting about this comment...
I don't understand something, because in my mind, the multi-stakeholder model is where different communities take responsibility for different decisions and they do different things. And that's very different than the multilateral model where everybody might be involved, but they're all trying to influence the governments. And that's why I think there's a very different view as what the multi-stakeholder model really is in different communities.
Which is also why I said earlier that I think one thing we need to do is develop that more. If you look at the Net Mundial, for example, the idea was very clear that all the stakeholders were going to work together to produce this one document. And there was no single group that was going to be responsible even for the final decision of that document. So what I find really interesting is that actually on the surveillance debate, in the roadmap part of the document, the text that is maintained is actually literally from the Brazil-German resolution on privacy from the UN General Assembly. That is the text that is maintained. So to say that intergovernmental negotiations are by definition not going to be successful is actually not correct on this particular issue. The problem was, from the perspective of civil society, that we could not go beyond what governance had already negotiated in the UN. And I personally think the text of that resolution isn't bad, so in that sense, It's not as if it's horrible to have it in there. The thing is that the temperature of the room, so to say, was very much to go beyond that. And that was a very strong tendency. And that wasn't possible because the government, or certain governments, were not willing to move on it. And that is an issue, I think, that you create a discourse that makes it sound as if everybody's going to do this, we're going to do it by rough consensus. But it isn't rough consensus if one player can decide this is going to make or break. That's not a rough consensus. That's not how the IETF works, right?
Okay, I'm going to throw it open and get other contributions if anyone wants to come in the... otherwise, we can come back to the panel. And it's a bit difficult for me to see in the light, but I think yeah, at the back there, there's one.
Thank you. Is it working?
Yes.
Right, it's working. I see Ms. Kovac's point in multi-stakeholderism, especially with reference to Net Mundial. One of the 12 countries co-hosting Net Mundial was Turkey. I'm from Turkey. And Turkey has a terrible record of freedoms in internet. And that country, my country being there, represented only by the government. I fought against it back in Turkey, that civil society should be there, private business should be there, but only government was there. So multi-stakeholderism indeed is becoming a whitewash, with civil society not presenting in the process, not being present in the process as strong as they can be. In the United States, that may not be the case, as Mr. Nelson says. I know American NGOs are very strong, but that's not the case in most other countries. Thank you.
You coming back on that? I think we're just going to get a response from Bertrand or Vint down the front here, please.
I had a quick response to that as well.
Yeah, go on then.
I wouldn't underestimate the power of companies like Microsoft and Google and Yahoo to represent the Turks who are upset with what their government's doing. We do it quietly, but we're certainly pressing against countries, particularly countries like Turkey, that are slipping backward, that have been slipping backwards. The good news in Turkey is the courts did reverse what the Prime Minister did, and I think having the IGF meeting in September in Istanbul is going to provide more pressure on the government to open up the internet and to maintain an open and free discussion online.
It's Vint again. I just wanted to draw attention once again to another aspect of this layering structure and the solution to problems arising in the internet. It sometimes happens that the parties who are capable of creating a solution, implementing it, and enforcing it may not be uniformly distributed. In some cases, you need technologists to find answers to problems and figure out how to implement them. On the other hand, sometimes technology will not solve the problem and you need something else. Sometimes it's the rule of law. Sometimes it is multilateral agreements in order to help enforce laws. And so the reason I want to draw this to your attention is that even if we have many stakeholders at interest who influence the outcome that is desired, it may still be that other parties, not everyone, are the only ones capable of actually implementing a solution to the problem. We need to recognize that, and sometimes we don't.
The Mundial document actually recognizes that. It talks about how we want it, the multi-stakeholder approach, but I think, I'm not quite sure exactly the language, but it says something to the effect of, the best people in the room, right? It's not everybody has to be everywhere. It does acknowledge that some people have certain skills and different problems need different people.
Tom, what I'm hearing is a lot of different ideas about what a multi-stakeholder approach to these core freedoms is, what it would mean, how it's implemented. Do you think, I don't get the sense that therefore there is actually a coherent sense of what it is and how it should work. There are just many different views of that. Do you think there's a coherent sense of how multi-stakeholder working should work? Does the US government have a clear sense of it, or is it work in progress even for you?
Well, I guess the internet governance system doesn't have a constitution. And so there is a certain degree of amorphousness to the system that we're describing. I think to some extent that's a good thing, because it's not a strictly regulated system. It's a slightly anarchic system. That's one of the qualities that we are trying to preserve, that ironically even some governments committed to internet freedom are trying to preserve. We know how it shouldn't work. It shouldn't work in the way that the gentleman from Turkey just described, where governments come to the table without civil society. It should work in a way that there's a chorus of voices, so that governments feel if they fail what we call the Washington Post test in the United States, don't do anything that you wouldn't want out there in the papers, which we sometimes fail, but I think usually keep in mind. That system is what keeps us honest. And I think we also know where we don't want to go in terms of a system where governments control and fragment and use the internet to defend, to shield themselves from critical voices. And I think, we're all, my job is to be concerned about negative trends. But in some ways, when I step back and think with perspective about where we are, and think about how much stake authoritarian governments have in ruining the system that we have created, and the extent to which they have thus far failed, I am perhaps more optimistic than most.
Do you think they've failed in China? Because my sense from the dealings I have is that there is effectively a Chinese internet. I mean, you can get around it, you can get over it, but very few people do. There's essentially a national internet in China. Isn't that what they've, by throwing a lot of technologists, a lot of money, the 50-cent army, and a whole bunch of other resources at the problem, haven't some governments been able to create that national internet?
I think they're trying. I would not say they have been able to do it. I think there are too many people, even in China, who are finding ways to get access to the global internet directly or indirectly. And, the fact that, I like to think of it this way. I run a little bureau in the State Department that spends less than $10 million a year trying to help people around the world communicate securely on the internet and to break through firewalls like the one that the Chinese government maintains. The Chinese government spends, I wish I knew the number, but it's probably on the order of tens of billions of dollars trying to fight back against this small guerrilla effort to help people in China break through the firewall. I think we're actually doing better than they are.
They have 300 million websites in China. All my students from China know exactly how to get through the Great Firewall of China. Now, they are the technologically elite. Maybe they're 1%, maybe they're 2%, but that's 6 to 10 million people. And they have friends. They can forward things. It's clear they can't control it all.
Good. Any other questions, contributions? First of all, anyone who hasn't spoken yet? No, I've seen Bertrand. Okay, yeah, Bertrand, come on in.
Yeah, just one follow-up on the remark from the gentleman from Turkey. It's important to remember that in the multi-stakeholder model, it is not about an option that was envisaged at one point, which was that the governments would come with civil society and business in tow and selecting who should be coming there. So in many countries, unfortunately, it is true that there is not enough civil society structures at the local level or business at the local level that are familiar with the international processes, that have the capacity or the money or resources to go there. This is why one of the objectives in the development of the IGF is to promote local IGFs and make sure that there are meetings at the national level that do something. That being said, as Mike was saying, the fact that the IGF, the global one, under UN flag, and it's important because it would mean that freedom of expression will be guaranteed on the UN territory of the IGF, the fact that it will take place in Istanbul will be particularly important given the context. And the final element is that, irrespective of what I said earlier regarding the difficulty of finding agreements on harmonization, I must say that, talking about Turkey, the fact that the court basically established an emerging norm, which is you do not block a whole platform for one piece of content, is for me an emerging global and international norm. Likewise, the uproar regarding the surveillance is not only a human rights issue, it is a major human rights issue, but it is also a question of applicability, extraterritorial applicability of national laws, and the uproar is due to the fact that more and more countries are seeing this as an overextension of national sovereignty to just apply the national jurisdiction on the operators based on their soil. These are emerging norms that we need to document because they facilitate an element of harmonization. And by the way, companies, through their terms of service, also play a de facto harmonization function, at least for their territory.
Thanks, Bertrand. I just want to put one final round of questions to all of the panelists. I work with a lot of human rights groups from different parts of the world, some of them quite vulnerable. And what strikes me is there's been a significant investment by some governments and private donors in technology, tools that enable people to evade surveillance and protect themselves and so on. I have to say, from the human rights activist point of view, they often seem quite difficult to use. There's often a very confusing array of tools on offer. I know very few people who feel equipped to use Tor, for example. You have to be very determined and relatively skilled to apply very, very high encryption standards like Tor. And so I wonder have we put too much emphasis on what I call the hubris of engineers, the fact that all of these problems have an engineering problem, when actually the protection of human rights is really a public policy problem, and a policy problem that has to be solved by emphasizing the importance of those core values, and that technology actually can't solve those problems because the users who turn on their machine or their mobile phone and want to use stuff are not, in my experience, often using the range of technologies that have been designed to help protect them. And I'll start with the technologist, Mike, for your reflections on that. And what can you do to make these technologies just more usable, more friendly, more accessible to people in very difficult circumstances who may have a very low technical skill or capacity?
It's already happening. As you said, in the early days of these privacy-enhancing technology, you needed a master's degree in computer science to use it. I'd say today, it's already quite a bit easier, and half an hour or an hour of training, and you can use these tools. But that's still a lot, and you have to be very motivated. In a year or two, these technologies will be built into the products that Google sells, that Microsoft sells. One of the results of the Snowden revelations is that we've made a commitment to end-to-end encryption. So when you send information to the cloud, it's encrypted all the way to the data center, and it's encrypted in the data center. And if we move it to a different data center, it's encrypted when we transfer it. So that is a major change. To the user, the service isn't going to look different. To a hacker, or to a foreign power that wants to tap into those data centers, it'll look very different and very hard to access. We'll still have to abide by local law when somebody comes after us and says, Frank, is somebody we suspect of having done something wrong, and if we have a subpoena, we'll have to abide by that. But we're not going to be hacked by governments that have been doing that in the past. So I think we're making good progress there. But I think the other technological opportunity, coming back to this need to mobilize the masses, is for companies like Microsoft, civil society, to use social media, to get the word out, to show people that there are ways to pressure governments. There are governments that are doing the right things, and there are governments that are doing the wrong things, and hold them accountable. Point out that the countries that are doing the right thing are attracting the most creative people and keeping them. The countries that are cracking down on dissidents and censoring the internet, they're losing some of their most creative people who want to be free. That's the argument we've made for years. And many governments are listening. Not the most repressive regimes, but the big bulk in the middle are starting to understand the value of human rights, not just privacy and freedom of speech, but some of the other important civil liberties that we've talked about in other sessions.
Anya, do you think there's been too much emphasis on the engineering side and less on the policy side?
I mean, it is really important, of course, but often because for activists in repressive countries, that is often the first thing they can turn to. But a colleague of mine said earlier today, a colleague from Morocco in a meeting, that because of surveillance clearly also happening in Western countries, activists in repressive countries feel much more fear as well, because the surveillance in the West is legitimizing what happens in their countries as well. And I think I'll keep emphasizing this again and again. I think there is a certain hypocrisy here which is really, really dangerous and undermines a lot of the values that, for example, the Freedom Online Coalition claims to stand for. Vint Cerf was also earlier talking about the importance that governments are also responsible for safety. Of course, that's true, but a crucial aspect of safety is trust. And knowing that there are secret courts, that's something that undermines trust in governments at a very fundamental level. And how are we going to regain that? Because perhaps this particular secret court is not secret anymore, and perhaps mechanisms of transparency and accountability are going to be put into place around us. But as long as there hasn't been a very strong signal from democratic governments as well that they recognize that this is wrong, that citizens should always know what the law says and how a court interprets the law, that's quite essential if you want to stay on the right side of the law. As long as there aren't much stronger signals about these kind of things, how is one ever going to regain that trust? And if we don't have that in Western countries, then why do we keep referencing to repressive countries like that? You have to set a standard yourself. In fact, earlier when we were talking about the national internets, the reference is always to China or Iran, but at the moment, actually, the biggest pressure for data localization is in democratic countries as a result of the revelations about NSA surveillance. That is actually one of the big challenges in large parts of the world right now. So let's set an example there.
Thank you. Frank?
Well, my answer to your question is very definite. The issue of human rights is always a political will issue. Those that are in power want to respect human rights or do not want to respect human rights. The technology, I think, helps and is important. I should never minimize it. But clearly, it's a political decision in which countries human rights are respected and protected and allowed. And secondly, I think human rights go with democracy. But even democracies, as Anya was pointing out, fall into contradictions as well, and oftentimes fall into violations of human rights as well. Secondly, I think the technological side has to be enhanced, yes, but I think there is a call for social responsibility, even from the human rights community with the Ruggie principles. And I understand that some corporations have done well, but even today, GNI, which I find a very interesting initiative, only has 3 corporations, the last I heard.
5.
5 corporations.
Just got LinkedIn and Facebook.
Good. That's very important because I think it has been an uphill battle to get corporations to join when, if it's a human rights initiative, you would think that more corporations would want to come in voluntarily.
No, it's hard work. It's a real
It is
commitment
hard
when
work,
you sign
yes.
up.
And finally, on the question of privacy and the question of security in general, we must never fall into the trap, and this is something I mentioned in my report, of making a challenge between individual security and human rights. Because if we fall into that trap, we are actually weakening both. My point is that only true democracies can respect fully human rights. Because when you talk about security, you're not talking only about security of people, of individuals. And yes, you want to protect content of information and their communication, but you're also talking about security of institutions, state institutions and democratic institutions, and you're also talking about the security of your democratic system. And therefore, there can never be a contradiction between the democratic system and the protection of individuals, because you can never, in the name of protecting individuals, weaken the democratic system, because otherwise we would be generating our own downfall. I think this is weakening democracy, and this is the big challenge. And I did say in my report very clearly that surveillance is a legitimate task of the state when it is to protect against unruly violence, especially terrorism, but it has to have a democratic procedure to it. It has to be decided by a court, and it has to be monitored judicially and observed by a parliament. And therefore, legitimate democratic surveillance will always be targeted surveillance, because there was always a decision. Cannot be mass surveillance. Mass surveillance will inevitably be a violation of privacy, and therefore would be a violation of human rights. I think these are important issues to talk about, because otherwise we will begin discussing contradictions that should never exist. Democracy and human rights need each other. I mean, only democracies can respect human rights. And the same thing happens with security. Real security can only be guaranteed by democratic, fully democratic systems in a democratic way.
Thank you. Tom?
Let me start with your specific question and then
Yeah,
come back to some of the more general points. In terms of the technology, I think there are different types of users out there who have different demands, and that drives a lot of what we do. So in China, for example, if you're an ordinary Chinese citizen, you want to access the uncensored World Wide Web, you want to read a news site, you want to get on YouTube, you want to have uncensored Google searches, then the technology you need is actually relatively simple, and there are millions of other people using it. Usability becomes more important than strict security. You don't need Tor for that. If you are a human rights activist and you are communicating about sensitive information, you might get arrested. If that communication were intercepted by the government, you need something that may be harder to use, that is more secure, but you have a greater incentive to learn how to use it. The holy grail is to develop a system that's fully secure, easy enough to use, that such a large number of people begin to use it, that the systems of internet censorship and repression become unsustainable. We're certainly not there yet, which is why you're also right that we have to place even greater emphasis on the policy side, and that's what this coalition is about. It's about delegitimizing those kinds of activities by governments, so that it's the United States saying so, it's Costa Rica, it's Estonia, it's Mongolia, saying that this kind of behavior is legitimate and this kind is not. Now, to Anya's point, you're absolutely right that we cannot do that if we don't set a good example. And I am terrified of the prospect that you just described, that perceptions of what Western democracies do in the surveillance realm are going to justify in the minds of governments in authoritarian countries practices that are deeply, deeply repressive. And that's why we're having this conversation, and that's why we're trying to have a conversation with the rest of the world about what we're doing. So we have to be very concerned about that, and we have to hold democratic countries accountable, and I expect that everyone here will hold the United States government accountable to the words that we have spoken about what comes next. But I also think we have to maintain the capacity to make distinctions. Otherwise, we fall into exactly the trap that we want to avoid. There is a difference between a democratic country that does engage in surveillance, but does so in a way that's monitored by courts and legislatures under rules that are transparent for the purpose of dealing with legitimate threats to the safety of its citizens, but strictly not to burden or stifle dissent, and a country that uses surveillance to put dissidents in prison and to maintain its power over civil society. And if we don't make that distinction, then it becomes far easier for repressive states to justify what they do. So we have a responsibility as well.
Okay, I'm going to conclude there. It's 4:25. The organisers have asked me to remind you that actually the meeting continues down at the Seaplane Harbour, which is a very interesting venue with I think a 50-year-old submarine on the roof hanging down and various other artifacts. But it's a series of discussions which involve another range of contributors. So when this meeting's over, if you just make your way downstairs, I think the buses will be arriving around 4:30, 4:45 to take people down to the harbour. So first of all, can I, on behalf of everyone, thank the contributors for contrasting, but I think always interesting, whether you agree with all of them or not, very interesting contributions and very important contributions to a debate that I suspect is going to run for quite some time to come. So can you show your appreciation in the traditional way, please?